I'd come home early to surprise my parents for their anniversary, quietly letting myself in through the side door. When I heard my mother's voice drifting from the kitchen, calm and practiced in a way that made my footsteps freeze instantly. "Don't fret," she was telling my sister Lacey. "We'll deceive her as usual, and she'll hand us the $250,000, just like every other time." I stood there in that hallway, keys still in my hand, feeling something cold and absolute settle through my entire body as I processed exactly what my mother had just said, and exactly who her apparently referred to. Stick with me, because what I discovered standing frozen in that hallway would reveal years of calculated manipulation I'd never once suspected, and would set into motion a response my family genuinely never saw coming. I remember the specific quality of that afternoon light filtering through the hallway window, dust motes drifting lazily in the warm air, the familiar smell of my mother's kitchen, cinnamon and something baking, all of it suddenly rendered strange and unfamiliar by the words I was hearing so clearly through the partially open kitchen door. I'd planned that visit carefully, bringing a small gift and a card, genuinely excited to surprise two people I'd loved unconditionally my entire life, arriving nearly an hour before we'd formally planned to meet specifically, so I could help set up a small celebration before they even realized I'd arrived. My name is Calla Ridgway. I'm 33 years old, and my parents, Foster and Marla Ridgway, had apparently spent years constructing an elaborate, calculated pattern of deception specifically designed to extract significant financial support from me, support I'd always genuinely believed represented legitimate family emergencies rather than the deliberate manipulation I was about to discover in horrifying, undeniable detail. I'd built a genuinely successful career over the preceding decade as a pharmaceutical industry consultant, work that had provided considerable financial stability and apparently made me exactly the kind of family resource my parents and younger sister Lacey had decided, at some point I still didn't fully understand, to systematically, repeatedly exploit through fabricated crises and manufactured emergencies. That specific overheard conversation, discovered entirely by accident during what I'd intended as a simple loving surprise visit, would ultimately unravel years of accumulated deception, revealing a pattern considerably more calculated and devastating than I could have possibly imagined standing frozen in that familiar hallway, keys still clutched tightly in my genuinely shaking hand. Over the preceding 6 years, I'd provided my family with financial support on at least 4 separate significant occasions, each one presented to me as a genuine, urgent crisis requiring my immediate assistance. A medical emergency involving my father's heart condition that apparently required expensive treatment insurance wouldn't fully cover. A housing crisis when my parents' mortgage lender apparently threatened foreclosure. A business emergency when Lacey's small boutique apparently faced sudden, unexpected supplier debts, and most recently, an elaborate story involving a family friend's legal troubles that apparently required immediate financial intervention to prevent serious consequences. Each of these situations had been presented to me with genuine urgency and considerable emotional pressure, my mother typically delivering the initial request through tearful phone calls that emphasized how desperately the family needed my help, how ashamed they felt having to ask, how they would never request such significant support unless the circumstances were genuinely dire and unavoidable. She had a particular way of pausing mid-sentence, as though overcome by emotion, before continuing with some additional devastating detail, a rhythm I now recognized with painful clarity as calculated pacing rather than genuine, spontaneous grief. I'd provided financial support each time, amounts ranging from $15,000 for that initial medical emergency to nearly $80,000 for the more recent legal situation, contributions that had, cumulatively, represented considerable sacrifice on my own part, delaying my own home purchase plans and reducing my retirement savings contributions throughout those years specifically to ensure my family received whatever support they'd apparently desperately needed. I'd never once seriously questioned the legitimacy of these various crises, genuinely trusting that my own parents wouldn't fabricate such significant, emotionally devastating situations purely to extract financial support from me, a trust that specific overheard conversation was about to reveal as devastatingly, completely misplaced. I remained frozen in that hallway for several long minutes, genuinely struggling to process what I was hearing, my mother's voice continuing calmly from the kitchen as she apparently walked Lacey through specific details regarding whatever new fabricated crisis they were currently planning to present to me. "We'll say it's about your car accident settlement falling through," my mother continued, her tone carrying the same practiced, business-like quality I'd normally associate with planning an ordinary family gathering rather than what I was now understanding represented calculated financial fraud against her own daughter. Kala always responds fastest to anything involving actual danger or legal trouble. We'll say the other driver's insurance is claiming you were actually at fault, that you're facing a genuine lawsuit. Lacey's response, considerably more casual than I might have expected given the genuinely devastating nature of what they were actually discussing, carried a tone suggesting this represented familiar, comfortable territory rather than any moral hesitation. That worked well last time too, she said. She's always so quick to just wire the money once she thinks something legal is involved. I stood there genuinely nauseated, processing the specific devastating recognition that my own sister apparently viewed our previous, genuinely traumatic-seeming crises with the same casual calculation my mother was currently displaying, understanding that these weren't isolated incidents of genuine family desperation, but rather an established, comfortable pattern they'd apparently perfected across multiple previous successful extractions. I remember pressing my back against the hallway wall, needing its physical solidity to steady myself as I continued listening, my mind racing through years of memories I now understood required complete, devastating re-examination. I thought about how genuinely distraught my mother had sounded during that first phone call about my father's supposed heart condition, tears audible even through the phone line, a performance so convincing I'd never once considered doubting its authenticity throughout the 6 years since. I thought about how I'd canceled a planned vacation of my own to rush emergency funds to them, genuinely terrified something might happen to my father before I could help, only now understanding that terror had been deliberately manufactured for exactly that specific, calculated purpose. My mother continued speaking, her voice carrying forward with the same unhurried confidence, discussing specific details about which hospital name might sound sufficiently credible, which lawyer's office letterhead Lacey might be able to source through a friend who worked in administrative support at a local firm. Details so calculated and specific that any lingering hope I'd held that I was somehow misunderstanding this conversation evaporated entirely. I remained hidden in that hallway, listening carefully as my parents and Lacey continued discussing specific details regarding this planned fabricated car accident crisis, learning, through their continued conversation, additional details that confirmed exactly how calculated and long-planned this entire pattern of deception genuinely represented. I learned that the medical emergency involving my father's heart condition 6 years earlier had been entirely fabricated, my father's health apparently never having faced any genuine crisis whatsoever. The $15,000 I'd provided during that initial devastating emergency, having actually funded a family vacation my parents had wanted to take but couldn't otherwise afford. I remember my mother mentioning, almost casually, how convincing my father's supposed hospital visit had seemed, even recalling a specific detail about borrowing a friend's medical scrubs to photograph him in a staged hospital setting, a level of theatrical planning that genuinely turned my stomach as I processed exactly how far they'd apparently been willing to go. I learned that the foreclosure crisis 3 years later had similarly been entirely fabricated, my parents' mortgage apparently never having faced any genuine default risk, that considerable sum instead funding renovations to their own home they'd wanted but hadn't wanted to explain honestly given how recently they'd already extracted significant financial support from me through the earlier fabricated medical crisis. My mother even laughed, briefly, recalling how she'd practiced her tearful phone call in front of a mirror beforehand, wanting to ensure her voice carried exactly the right note of desperate embarrassment. I stood there, processing wave after wave of devastating revelation, understanding that every significant financial sacrifice I'd made throughout the preceding 6 years, sacrifices that had genuinely delayed my own home purchase and reduced my retirement savings considerably, had actually funded my family's various wants and comfortable lifestyle choices rather than any genuine crisis or emergency whatsoever. I made the deliberate decision, standing there in that devastating hallway, to leave quietly rather than immediately confronting my family with what I just overheard, understanding that I needed considerable time to process this devastating revelation before deciding exactly how I intended to respond to years of calculated, deliberate manipulation. I slipped back out the side door as quietly as I'd entered, driving away from my parents' house with hands trembling considerably more than I'd initially realized, processing genuine devastation regarding exactly how thoroughly my own family had apparently viewed me throughout recent years, not as a genuinely loved daughter and sister, but as a reliable, exploitable financial resource they could manipulate through fabricated crises whenever convenient. I remember pulling into a grocery store parking lot roughly 10 minutes into that drive, unable to continue safely given how badly my hands were shaking, sitting there in my car for nearly 20 minutes simply trying to breathe through the specific, physical shock my entire body seemed to be experiencing. I drove to my own apartment that evening and sat in stunned silence for hours, replaying every previous emergency through this devastating new understanding, recognizing specific details throughout each crisis that, in hindsight, should have perhaps raised more genuine skepticism than I'd ever allowed myself throughout those earlier, emotionally overwhelming situations. I thought about small inconsistencies I'd previously dismissed without examination. How my father had seemed remarkably healthy and energetic mere weeks after his supposed cardiac crisis, how the foreclosure notice my mother had once shown me briefly, before quickly putting it away, had somehow never appeared again when I'd later asked, in passing, how that entire situation had ultimately resolved. I understood, processing everything throughout that difficult evening, that I needed both emotional support and practical strategic guidance regarding exactly how to respond to this devastating discovery, understanding that whatever response I ultimately chose would need to reflect careful consideration rather than any immediate, purely emotional reaction. I called my closest friend Rosalind Beckett that same evening, sharing everything I'd overheard and processing genuine devastation, alongside her own shocked, supportive reaction throughout our lengthy conversation. "You need actual documentation," she told me firmly. "Not just what you overheard, but real proof of the pattern. If you want to genuinely hold them accountable, rather than just having this turn into another conversation where they somehow convince you that you misunderstood." Rosalind had known my family for nearly 15 years, having met me during graduate school, and I remember the particular quality of her silence when I first described what I'd heard, a silence that told me she was recalculating years of her own observations about my family through this same devastating new lens. "I always thought it was strange how many crises your family seemed to have," she admitted quietly. I never wanted to say anything because it felt presumptuous, but looking back now, the timing always did seem oddly convenient, always right around when you'd mention getting a bonus or a raise. That observation landed with its own particular weight, confirming that this pattern had apparently been visible enough, even from the outside, that a close friend had noticed something worth quiet concern years before I'd ever allowed myself to consider it directly. I consulted directly with an attorney, Marcus Delgado, specializing in financial fraud cases, walking him carefully through everything I'd overheard and the broader pattern of previous emergencies. This discovery had suddenly, devastatingly recontextualized. "If you can establish that these were genuinely fabricated situations used to extract money under false pretenses," he explained, "you may have legitimate grounds for pursuing formal fraud charges, though I understand that pursuing legal action against your own parents represents a genuinely significant, difficult decision beyond simply the legal considerations themselves." Marcus asked me detailed, methodical questions throughout that initial consultation, walking through each previous emergency chronologically, noting specific dates, dollar amounts, and any documentation I might still possess, including bank transfer records, text messages, and emails exchanged during each crisis. He explained that building a genuinely strong case would require considerably more than simply my own account of the overheard conversation, emphasizing the importance of gathering concrete, verifiable evidence before taking any formal action. I spent the following days carefully documenting everything I remembered from each previous crisis, cross-referencing dates and specific details against my own financial records, building a careful timeline that, once assembled, painted an even more devastating, undeniable picture of calculated, repeated manipulation than my initial overheard conversation alone had revealed. I found myself, throughout that process, discovering small inconsistencies I'd never previously noticed. A hospital name in one supposed medical bill that, upon closer examination, didn't match any actual facility in our region, a settlement letter from an insurance company that used language no legitimate insurer would ever actually employ, details that, once I finally allowed myself to scrutinize them honestly, revealed themselves as obviously fabricated. I decided, working carefully with both Rosalind and Marcus's guidance, to allow my family's newly planned fabricated car accident crisis to actually unfold as they intended, understanding that catching them directly in the act of presenting this specific, entirely fictional emergency would provide considerably more concrete, undeniable evidence than confronting them immediately based purely on the overheard conversation alone. My mother called me exactly as I'd anticipated roughly 1 week later, her voice carrying the same practiced, tearful urgency I now recognized clearly as calculated performance rather than any genuine distress. "Kala, something terrible has happened," she said. "Lacey was in a car accident, and the other driver's insurance is claiming she was actually at fault. She's facing a genuine lawsuit, and we need considerable help covering potential legal costs." I responded exactly as they would have expected based on my previous pattern, expressing genuine-sounding concern and asking careful, detailed questions regarding the specific situation, questions I'd actually prepared in advance with Marcus's guidance, specifically designed to generate responses that would further confirm the fabricated nature of this entire supposed crisis. I asked which specific intersection the accident had supposedly occurred at, which insurance company was involved, and whether a police report had been filed. Watching even through the phone, how my mother's answers grew increasingly vague and inconsistent the more specific my questions became. I recorded that entire phone conversation, having confirmed with Marcus that our state's specific consent laws permitted this given my own direct participation in the call, gathering exactly the kind of concrete, undeniable evidence that would prove considerably more difficult for my family to dismiss or explain away than any confrontation based purely on secondhand, overheard information. I requested a formal family meeting roughly 2 weeks after that recorded phone call, informing my parents and Lacey only that I needed to discuss something significant, without providing any specific indication regarding exactly what that conversation would actually address. I laid out everything clearly and directly once we'd gathered the overheard conversation from their kitchen, the subsequent recorded phone call confirming their planned fabricated car accident crisis, and the broader timeline I'd carefully assembled documenting each previous emergency, alongside specific details that, once properly examined, confirmed their entirely fictional nature. "I heard you," I told them, my voice carrying a controlled devastation rather than explosive anger. "Standing in that hallway, Mom, I heard you telling Lacey exactly how you plan to deceive me again. 6 years of fabricated emergencies. Nearly $200,000 total. Money that funded vacations and renovations and whatever else you wanted. While I genuinely believed I was helping my own family survive actual crises." My mother's face drained of color as she processed exactly how much I'd actually discovered, her initial attempt at denial crumbling quickly once I calmly played the recorded phone call, her own voice confirming the fabricated nature of Lacey's supposed car accident with devastating, undeniable clarity. I watched her expression shift through several stages, first genuine shock at being caught so thoroughly, then a brief, almost reflexive attempt at further deflection, before finally settling into something that looked, at least in that specific moment, like authentic recognition of exactly how completely her explanations had just collapsed. My father remained largely silent throughout this initial confrontation, his own discomfort visible but offering no genuine defense of what had occurred, a silence that felt, in its own way, almost as devastating as my mother's earlier calculated performances, confirming that he'd apparently been a willing, if quieter, participant throughout this entire extended pattern of deception. Lacey, for her part, attempted a defense that revealed considerably more about her own character than she likely intended. "You have so much money, Kala," she said, her voice carrying genuine irritation rather than any remorse. "I don't understand why this is such a big deal. It's not like you were ever going to miss it." I stared at her for a long moment, genuinely processing the specific callousness of that statement, understanding that whatever relationship I'd once believed we shared as sisters had apparently never included the basic respect required to simply ask me honestly for help rather than manufacturing elaborate lies to manipulate me into providing it. I informed my family clearly, during that difficult confrontation, that I intended to pursue formal legal action to recover the funds they'd fraudulently extracted throughout the preceding 6 years, understanding that genuine accountability required consequences considerably more significant than simply confronting them verbally and hoping for authentic, lasting change. My parents attempted various justifications throughout the following weeks, my mother eventually offering an explanation that revealed troubling entitlement rather than any genuine remorse. "You have so much more than the rest of us," she said during one particularly difficult conversation. "We just needed help, and you were always so willing to give it. Was it really so wrong to make sure you understood how serious things were?" I found her use of the phrase, "make sure you understood how serious things were," particularly striking, a phrase that reframed calculated, deliberate lies as simply a persuasive technique rather than genuine fraud, revealing exactly how thoroughly she'd apparently rationalized this entire pattern to herself throughout the years she'd been actively deceiving me. I pursued formal legal action working alongside Marcus, ultimately reaching a settlement that required my parents to repay a significant portion of the fraudulently extracted funds through a structured payment plan. Given their limited ability to provide immediate, full repayment of the entire amount they'd accumulated through years of calculated deception, Marcus explained that pursuing the full amount through extended litigation would likely prove both emotionally exhausting and practically difficult, given my parents' actual financial resources, advising instead that a structured settlement, while imperfect, would provide genuine accountability without requiring years of additional, draining legal proceedings. Lacey's own relationship with our parents grew increasingly strained throughout this period as well, her own participation in the scheme becoming a source of genuine tension once the broader family and extended relatives learned the full, devastating scope of what had actually occurred. Several aunts and uncles, once they learned the details, expressed genuine shock and disappointment, some reaching out to me directly with support I genuinely appreciated, others maintaining an uncomfortable neutrality that revealed its own kind of quiet disappointment regarding how thoroughly this revelation had disrupted our extended family's previously comfortable assumptions. Standing in my own home roughly 2 years after that devastating overheard conversation, having finally purchased the house I delayed pursuing for years while unknowingly funding my family's fabricated emergencies, I thought often about that specific moment frozen in my parents' hallway, keys still clutched in my genuinely shaking hand. I'd learned, throughout that entire painful process, something genuinely important about the specific vulnerability that comes from genuine trust and love, understanding that my own willingness to help my family during what I'd believed were genuine crises had been calculated and exploited specifically because of that authentic care, a realization that required considerable time and reflection to process without allowing it to permanently damage my own capacity for genuine trust more broadly. Rosalind helped me considerably throughout that ongoing processing, reminding me gently, whenever my own lingering guilt or self-doubt resurfaced, that the fault for this entire situation rested entirely with the people who had chosen deliberate deception, not with my own genuine, loving instinct to help family members I believed were suffering. My relationship with my parents remained permanently, significantly altered following that devastating discovery, our interactions now limited to occasional, formal communication rather than the closeness I'd once genuinely believed our family shared throughout those years of calculated manipulation. My mother reached out several times throughout that first year, her messages alternating between attempts at justification and occasional, seemingly genuine expressions of regret, though I found myself unable to fully trust the sincerity of either, given how thoroughly her earlier performances had demonstrated exactly how convincingly she could manufacture whatever emotional tone a given situation seemed to require. My relationship with Lacey fared even worse throughout that same period, her own defensive response during our initial confrontation having revealed a fundamental disregard for my own feelings and autonomy that felt, in many ways, even more difficult to process than our parents' behavior, given how close we'd once been throughout our earlier childhood years before whatever calculation had eventually reshaped how she viewed our relationship. I don't regret the years of financial support I provided before discovering the truth, understanding that my own genuine intentions throughout that period remained honorable regardless of how thoroughly my family chose to exploit them. What I do carry forward, standing now in a home built on my own honest, protected resources, is considerably more careful discernment regarding exactly how family loyalty and genuine crisis should actually be verified before ever again allowing love alone to determine how significantly I'm willing to sacrifice for people who, I've now learned with painful clarity, never actually valued that sacrifice as anything beyond a resource to be calculated and exploited. I've built, throughout these past 2 years, a smaller but considerably more genuine circle of relationships, people like Rosalind who've demonstrated, consistently and without any hidden calculation, exactly what authentic care and mutual respect actually look like. That distinction I've come to understand clearly matters considerably more than simply the amount of love someone claims to feel. It matters whether that claimed love ever asks you honestly for what it actually needs, or whether it simply calculates the easiest, most effective way to take what it wants.